Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Doug Harbrecht, and I'm treasurer of the National Press Club and Washington News editor of Businessweek magazine. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio or the global Internet Computer Network. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind members of some upcoming speakers. On Monday, April 8th, Konstantin Simites, the Prime Minister of Greece, will talk about Greece at the dawn of the millennium, challenges and prospects. On Tuesday, April 9th, First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton will address the Press Club audience. And on Wednesday, April 10th, Bud Greenspan, award-winning sports historian and official cinematographer of the Olympic Games, will talk about the status of amateur sports. Transcripts and audio and videotapes of Press Club luncheons are available by calling 1-800-NPC-2334. If you have any questions for our speaker today, please write them on cards provided at your table and pass them up to me. I will ask as many as time permits. I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. From your right, Irving R. Levine, retired economic correspondent for NBC News and Dean, School of International Studies of Lynn University. Jackie Frank of Reuters. Kim Willinson, Japan Digest. Bill Miller, Industry Week magazine. Tracy Longo, Kiplinger's Finance magazine. Our guest today, Lester Thurow. Peggy Roberson, freelance journalist and chairman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Joan Walsh Cassidy, associate publisher, King Publishing Group. Hiratsugu Koike, Nikkei Washington Bureau. Aaron Zittner, Boston Globe. And Dave Martin, Congressional Quarterly and Secretary of the National Press Club. More than a decade ago, Lester Thurow was worrying whether radical changes in the U.S. and world economy would leave some American workers behind. Two important books, The Zero-Sum Game, published in 1980, and The Zero-Sum Solution, published in 1985, raised critical questions about the declining standard of living for many in the United States. Now presidential wannabes from Bill Clinton and Bob Dole to Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan are all echoing Thurow's concerns. Our guest today has been a professor of management and economics at MIT for more than 20 years, beginning in 1968. He was dean of the renowned MIT Sloan School of Management from 1987 until 1993. The Sloan School, of course, is famous for its integration of the practical and theoretical in management. The practical side of business came to him very early, for he spent 4 summers working in the Butte copper mines. A 1960 graduate of Williams College, he received his MA in 1962 on a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford and his PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1964. He taught at Harvard for 2 years after a term as a staff economist on President Johnson's Council of Economic Advisors. His experience there during the buildup of the Vietnam War taught him, as he said in an interview, that fouling up the economy wasn't done by accident, it was done deliberately with everybody's eyes wide open. He's been at MIT ever since and has just returned there following a 2-year leave of absence where he enjoyed a number of adventures ranging from a safari across Saudi Arabia, hunting polar bears with a camera in the Arctic, and mountain climbing in South America and the Himalayas. He currently chairs the Lemelson MIT Prize Program, which recognizes and promotes the spirit of individual ingenuity in America. We hope he feels at home here at the National Press Club. He has served on the editorial board of the New York Times as a contributing editor for Newsweek magazine and as a member of Time magazine's Board of Economics. His new book, The Future of Capital, speaks to the key factors causing economic change and offers strategies for profiting from today's world in flux. Let us extend a warm National Press Club welcome to Dr. Lester Thurow.
This afternoon, I would like you to imagine that you're Columbus. You know a place to make a lot of money. It's called the Indies. There's a conventional way to get there. It's called walking east. Marco Polo did it several hundred years earlier, but you have a better idea. It's called sailing west. The problem is you have a map, and on half the map it says terra incognita, unknown territory. But you've got to build a ship of some size, put sails on it, and your most important decision, of course, is how much water are you going to put on that ship. Because if you don't have enough water on that ship, you're all going to die of thirst before you get there, and this is not going to be a successful voyage. And I want you to think about that in the economic context. Now, if you're Columbus, obviously the first thing you want to know is, what do we know about the world? So let me start by giving you 5 topographical facts about our modern economic world. Topographical fact number 1. If you go back to the 1960s and correct for inflation, you'll find that the world capitalist economy grew at 5.0% per year. In the 1970s, that went down to 3.6. In the 1980s, it went down to 2.8. And in the first 6 years of the 1990s, it's been only 2.0. 25 years passes, and capitalism loses 60% of its momentum. Why? Second topographical fact. So you go to the world's biggest economy, Western Europe, an economy that has 50% more people than the United States, and you look at that economy over the last 2 decades and ask, how many net new jobs has the world's biggest economy produced in a 20-year period of time? The answer is 0. The question is why? And suppose, topographical fact number 3, you go to the industrial economy, Japan, which has been the world's best performer of the wealthy industrial countries since World War II, and you ask yourself the question, how fast has Japan grown in the last 5 years? The answer is approximately 0. Topographical fact number 4, you come to the United States and you remember John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, the rising tide raises all boats. Once again, you correct for inflation, and you notice that between 1973 and 1975, the American per capita GDP goes up 36%. So the tide goes up by more than a third. You then go off and look at the Department of Labor data for this group called non-supervisory workers, basically everybody in America who doesn't boss anybody else, about 80% of the workforce. Once again corrected for inflation, you find that their hourly wage rate goes down 14%. The tide goes up and 80% of the boats sink. Why? Topographical fact number 5, you go down to Mexico in the summer of 1994, which is not ancient history. And in the summer of 1994, Mr. Salinas is a hero on the cover of every magazine. This is the country that has done it perfectly. They go from a big budget deficit to a budget surplus. They sell 1,000 state-owned companies, including the telephone company, to an American group. They deregulate and privatize everything. And in the NAFTA treaty, they promised to do something that no other country has had the guts to do. They will essentially completely deregulate agriculture over a 15-year period of time, and the Mexican corn and bean farmer will go head-to-head with the Iowa corn and bean farmer. Fast forward just 7 months, February 1995, Mr. Salinas is once again on the cover of every magazine. This time he's a possible drug dealer or a possible murderer and incompetent. The Mexicans have lost 1 million jobs, and imagine this happening in the United States. The standard of living of the average middle-class Mexican family has fallen 50% in a 7-month period of time. That would be revolutionary if it happened in the United States. How do you consistently explain all those things? What explanations would you offer? What I would like to argue to you today, if you want to understand what's going on, it's helpful to borrow 2 concepts from the physical sciences. The first concept I want to borrow from geology is the concept of plate tectonics. What I've been talking about are the economic equivalents of earthquakes and volcanoes. And if you look at real earthquakes and volcanoes, you learn nothing about them by sitting there and staring at the St. Andreas Fault. If you want to know about earthquakes and volcanoes, you've got to study plate tectonics, these giant continental plates miles under the surface of the Earth, pushing into each other, under each other. They cause these surface manifestations of earthquakes and volcanoes. And today I want to argue that there are 5 fundamental forces that are all just as irresistible as continental plate tectonics that are fundamentally changing the nature of capitalism and bending our economy. The second concept I want to borrow from the physical sciences is a concept I'm going to borrow from evolutionary biology. It's the concept of punctuated equilibrium. Normally, if you're at the top of the food chain, survival of the fittest species, you have nothing to worry about evolution. You simply become bigger, meaner, tougher, and more dominant. And of course, the best example is the dinosaurs. For 130 million years, they rule the surface of the earth, and each generation of dinosaurs is simply to be bigger, tougher, longer-toothed than the previous generation of dinosaurs. Then all of a sudden, a period of punctuated equilibrium comes along. Maybe a period as short as 10,000 years, and every single dinosaur dies or becomes a small bird, whichever you like, and out the other side, the dominant species is the mammal, us. And of course, you and I wouldn't be here today if those dinosaurs hadn't disappeared, because they would have eaten our ancient ancestors, and we never would have made it. Now, a period of punctuated equilibrium is a period of great pessimism and great optimism. It's not either or, it's both. If you're a dinosaur, it's very pessimistic. If you're a mammal, it's the opportunity of a lifetime. Now, what I want to argue is that these 5 fundamental forces, which I will look at briefly, are producing a period of punctuated equilibrium that we are in at the moment. And what comes out the other side is going to be very different from what went in on a whole set of dimensions, and that's what I talk about in my new book, The Future of Capitalism. Let me first mention each of the 5 fundamental plates and then talk a little bit about some of them. The first one is the end of communism. 1/3 of humanity, 1.9 billion people, used to live in the old communist world. They're going to join the old capitalist world. That's going to change them, but as I will show you, that is going to change us in some remarkably profound ways. You can't swallow a mouthful that big without changing. Secondly, we're moving from an era of natural resource-based industries into an era of man-made brain power industries. Third is demography. The world population is rapidly growing, rapidly moving, and rapidly becoming older. We are going to be the first human society ever dominated by the elderly. In all other human societies, older people have been a small minority. But by 2025, they will be a voting majority in the United States. Not a majority of the population, but since we don't let people 0 to 18 vote, they will be a voting majority. The fourth fundamental force is a global economy, where because of transportation and communication technologies, for the first time in human history, you can make anything anywhere on the face of the globe and sell it everywhere else on the face of the globe. Never been true before. And the fifth fundamental force is, for the first time in more than 200 years, we will have no dominant economic, political, or military power that says this is the way the game is played. I enforce the rules, I write the rules, and you will live by my rules. In the 19th century, that role was played by Great Britain and the British Empire. In the 20th century, that role was played by the United States. And in the 21st century, nobody will play that role. And what it means is the game is going to be very amorphous. And for those of us who live in the United States, it will not be an Anglo-Saxon game, and we will have to learn to play something quite different. Let me start by briefly looking at each of these fundamental plates to illustrate their importance. There are lots of things you could say, but let's start with the end of communism. 2 quick facts. Suppose you're in the oil business. We used to say something that was never true. We used to say Saudi Arabia was the world's largest producer of oil. Saudi Arabia never was the world's largest producer of oil. The old Soviet Union was always the world's largest producer of oil. But we didn't count it because its oil stayed in the communist world and didn't affect the capitalist world very much. The world's biggest pool of oil is not under the Persian Gulf, but probably under the Caspian Sea, and there may be a bigger one off the north coast of Siberia. If you're in the oil business, where you drill your wells, where you build your pipelines, who you negotiate with, what you think about the future price of energy is just radically different after communism went away. Second fundamental fact about the communist world. You know, every social system does some things well and some things badly. The communist economies could not cater to individual wants. And I have my own prime example. Back when communism was alive and well and you went to GUM, the big department store, the longest lines were always for female lingerie. There were never any lines at the stores for male underwear. 0 lines. Why? The central planners made exactly the same number of both. But everywhere in the world, women buy about 3 times as much underwear as men. And so what was plenty of underwear for the males was not plenty of underwear for the females, and in 80 years, they couldn't get this idea into their mind. But, as I said, every social system does some things well. The communists ran an excellent education system. Take any communist country and it's better educated than its neighbors. Cuba is the best educated country in South America. China is far better educated than India. and Eastern Europe is better educated than Western Europe. The Soviet Union is a high science society, had more engineers and scientists than any society on the face of the earth except the United States. Twice as many space shots as we had in America. This is going to have some profound effect as these people join the world economy. Why should I pay an American physicist $75,000 a year when I can get a Nobel Prize winner in the Soviet Union for $100 a month? We've already got American companies that have set up engineering groups in St. Petersburg, which they manage electronically, and they get world-class science and engineering for $100 a month. Or suppose I want a very bright, very hardworking, very well-educated high school graduate. I will go across the border from Hong Kong to Guangdong, and for $35 a month, I will get that person. And that person will work 29 days per month, 11 hours a day, a wage rate of 11 cents an hour, and I can guarantee you that that person is brighter, better educated, and harder working than the average American high school graduate. That educated humanity that comes out of the second world is going to have enormous impacts on wages in the first world. The second fundamental plate is the shift from natural resource-based industries into man-made brain power industries. This factor I can illustrate very simply by just reading two lists. Let me read you the list of companies which were the original 12 companies in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the biggest companies in America on January 1st, 1900. The list is in alphabetical order. There are two things interestingly about this list. See if you can catch them. The American Cotton Oil Company, the American Steel Company, the American Sugar Refining Company, Continental Tobacco, Federal Steel, General Electric, National Lead, Pacific Mail, People's Gas, Tennessee Coal and Iron, U.S. Leather, U.S. Rubber. Think of it. National Lead was one of the 12 biggest companies in America, and 10 of those 12 companies were natural resource companies. What's the other interesting thing about that list? How many of them are alive today? Only one, General Electric, which is why people write books about General Electric. And if you think of the 12 biggest companies in America today, how many of them do you think are going to be alive 100 years from now? If it's more than 3, I will be very surprised, and it may very well be 0 that will be alive 100 years from now. The second list of names I'm going to read to you is a list of names constructed 90 years later by the Ministry of International Trade and Industry in Japan for their book called The Vision for the 1990s. It was those industries which the Japanese thought were the most important to conquer. Highest wages, highest profits, most exciting technologically. 7 industries on this list: microelectronics, biotechnology, the new materials industries, telecommunications, civilian aircraft manufacturing, machine tools plus robotics, computers, software plus hardware. How many natural resource-based industries are there in that list? None. What's the common denominator of that list? This is a list of man-made brain power industries. If you say, where will these industries actually be? The answer is wherever somebody organizes the brain power to capture them. They can be anywhere, including on the moon. Think about the great 2 high technology areas in America, Silicon Valley and Route 128. What do they have in common? One has nice weather and one has lousy weather. One's laid back and the other's uptight. One's on the East Coast, one's on the West Coast, and they have nothing in common except this is where the brain power happens to be. Plate number 3, demography. World population, according to the World Bank, is expected to grow from 5.7 billion to 8.5 billion by the year 2030, a 50% increase. The scary thing about this is not the 50% increase, but the fact that the World Bank expects that 2 billion out of these 2.8 billion people will be born in countries where today the daily wage is less than $2 per day. If that actually happens, that is Malthusian in a major way, because there is no way the poorest countries on the face of the globe can absorb 2 billion people in the next 34 years. But population forecasts have often been wrong. Perhaps this population forecast will be wrong. The 2 other things happening in demography are absolutely certain. First is migration. People are moving across national borders at rates never before even imagined. In the 1980s, 7.9 million people legally came into the United States. 7.3 million people legally came into the rest of the wealthy industrial world, and probably something on the order of 5 or 6 million people came illegally, for a total of 20 million. And 80 million people moved across national boundaries from slightly poorer to slightly richer countries within the third world, like Filipino maids going to Hong Kong, and we created 20 million refugees. The world has never seen anything like it, both in terms of size and the fact that for the first time in human history, people are moving from poor countries to rich countries. In the 19th century, the numbers were lower, and people were moving from rich countries, England, Germany, and Italy, to empty countries, the United States, Argentina, and Australia. The empty countries needed people. The people who move to the rich countries today may be energetic. They move, so they have a certain energy level, but they're uneducated and unskilled, and the developed world doesn't need uneducated and unskilled people. The problem, of course, is they're coming, and it's virtually impossible to stop them because something has happened which is profound. For the first time in human history, everybody knows what standards of living are elsewhere in the world. It was mentioned that I took a safari across Saudi Arabia with my oldest son, and I had this fact driven home to me in a very vivid way. There was one day we were going through the empty quarter where we were at least 200 miles to the nearest road, telephone line, electrical line. We came across an encampment of Bedouins, about 10 to 15 tents, herding camels, 500 or 600 camels, and right in the middle of the tents was a satellite dish on a Honda generator, and they were watching TV. Now, I joked they were watching the lifestyles of the rich and famous. I don't really know that since women were involved, but they were watching TV. Why should you sit in a village where their per capita income is $200 when you know there are these places where their per capita income is $30,000 and all you have to do is get up and walk? The third part of the demography plate is even more profound, the elderly. This is going to change psychology and sociology in ways that we can't even imagine. In 1900, 3% of the American population were over the age of 65. Today, 13% of the American population is over the age of 65. And when you get out there into 2025, depending on what you think about migration, something in the order of 25 to 30% of the entire population will be over 65. But since, as I mentioned, you don't let young people vote, they will effectively be a voting majority. And the problem is, in all industrial countries and in the United States, we have what I call the double 40 whammy. 40% of all the income going to all the elderly people in America comes out of Bill Clinton's budget. And for 40% of the elderly get 80% of their income out of Bill Clinton's budget. This is completely bending budgets all around the world out of shape. Democracy is not a survival of the fittest species. It's only been around for 100 years in the sense of letting everybody vote. How does democracy cut the benefits to a group of people who are in fact a majority of its voters? It'll have to be done for a very simple reason. In 1963, 23% of the federal budget went to the elderly. In 1993, 47% of the federal budget goes to the elderly. In 2003, 58% of the federal budget goes to the elderly. In 2013, 75% of the federal budget goes to the elderly. And in 2023, they get 105. Now, of course, they can't have 105 because there are other things that have to be done. But what expenditures on the elderly are doing is pushing everything else out of our budgets. Infrastructure investment is down by 50%. Research and development is down by 1/3. Educational spending is down. Exactly the social investment you need to have a successful future we are not making as the elderly push these budgets out of whack. The fourth fundamental plate is the development of a global economy where you can make anything, anywhere, and sell it everywhere. I don't need to comment on that too much because we all know it's true and it's all a profound change in the capitalist world economy. But let's go to the fifth fundamental force, no dominant economic power that can set and enforce the rules. This is something that's going to make a big difference. And the best way to illustrate it is two of our current trade disputes. Take the dispute with the Chinese about intellectual property rights. Today, if I go to Beijing, I can buy $100,000 worth of American computer software on a CD-ROM for $100. And the Chinese were selling The Lion King before Disney issued it. How do you sell something if somebody else is selling your product at a price below your production costs because they have no production costs? If the Chinese won't enforce intellectual property rights, whole industries are going to disappear or become much smaller. And of course, the problem is not so simple as to say they're cheating. people in different parts of the world have very different attitudes as to what intellectual property rights ought to be. I remember the first time I went to Korea, which was in the early 1970s, the Koreans happily wheeled out all my books published in Korean. They'd never asked me and they never paid me, and they thought I ought to be proud. And of course, the reason is that the Koreans have a very different view of professors. In Korea, professors are paid for being eminent people, and in the United States, we're paid on the piecework basis. And so what was unimportant to a Korean professor was very important to me. But we don't have the capacity to force the Chinese to adopt the American view of intellectual property rights if they don't want to. We can stop them from selling things in the United States, but we're only 23% of the world economy. 75% of the sales are outside of the United States, where we can't stop them. And so if they want to sell the Lion King in India, they will sell the Lion King in India. The other trade dispute that illustrates the problem is the dispute we basically had with the common market, or the French, about limits on American television programs and movies in the European common market. The Europeans want to impose a rule which says American companies can't make more than 40% of the movies and television programs. That sounds kind of reasonable until you remember that we already have an 80% market share. So it would cut our sales in half, and what would happen 1 minute after the European community had a 40% rule, everybody else would have a 40% rule. And the Europeans argue we're just defending our culture. And of course, in some sense, that's true. What's culture to the Europeans is economics to the Americans, but we don't have the capacity anymore to beat the Europeans over the head and say you have to take our movies and television programs, you can't put limits on them. And they may very well end up putting limits on them one way or another. Now, if you take those 5 fundamental forces, the question is, how do they explain some of those mysteries I mentioned at the beginning, and what are the potential volcanoes and earthquakes coming along? Let me take just one of those mysteries, the mystery that occurred in the United States, where we have per capita income going up by 1/3 after correcting for inflation, and wages for 80% of the American population going down by 14% after correcting for inflation. What's going on? Well, it's the following story. First of all, part of it is the global economy. If you can move production to places where wages are lower, and people from low-wage countries can move to countries where which wages are higher, you're going to do what economists call factor price equalization, which means wages are going to fall in high-wage countries and wages are going to rise in what are called low-wage countries. It's partly technology. We have a skill-intensive technology shift going on where business firms in what used to be good jobs for relatively unskilled people now want very different human beings. One of the good examples is probably the automobile industry. They used to pay basically college wages, $20, $30 an hour, to people who are high school graduates and high school dropouts to work on the assembly lines. They don't do that anymore. If you look at new hires in that industry, they tend to all have some junior college education because they're going to do statistical quality control, just-in-time inventories, push decisions down the hierarchy, and they need a skill level at the bottom that they didn't used to need, and so high school dropouts and high school graduates aren't going to get those jobs anymore. Third, we have a national policy to reduce wages. It's called the War on Inflation, run by Mr. Greenspan. Remember what the strategy is. Put your foot on the brakes to slow the rate of growth of the economy, to push unemployment up, to hold wages down, to keep prices constant. That's a war that's been fought for 25 years. It's a war, I think, which has been won, but it's been won at the price of having wages going down. And it, of course, produces that downsizings that bother everybody, because suppose the governor of the economy says the economy can't grow faster than 2% without inflation, which is what the Federal Reserve Board does in fact say. Suppose I'm then running a big corporation where my productivity is growing at 6. That means at the end of each and every year I have 4% of my workforce I don't need. Every 3 years I have 12% of my workforce I don't need, and I need to have a huge downsizing once every 3 years. And if you look at the people downsized, they take an enormous cut in their income, and if you're over the age of 55, you're thrown out of the economy completely. And if you think about this, the average economy where productivity is growing at 2, labor force is growing at 1, the market is growing at 2. That means at the end of every year, either unemployment has to be 1 percentage point higher, that's the European answer, or wages have to have fallen enough so people will absorb those people into existing activities, and effectively we're replacing high-cost equipment with low-cost people. The fourth thing going on is with the end of communism, socialism, and basically the labor movement, capitalism is in a position to be much tougher on its workforce. Take the statistic that used to gets a lot of attention, the fact that 20 years ago the average CEO was making 35 times as much as the average employee, and today he or she, and it's mostly he, is making 160 times as much. You wouldn't have done that in the 1950s in France or Italy, because if the companies had dared to do it, the communists would have won the next election. You wouldn't have done that in Germany and Britain in the 1950s, because if you dared to do it, the socialists would have won the next election. And if you noticed your New York Times a week or two ago, last year CEO salaries went up 30%, and the wages of the average worker went up 2.5%. In the 1950s, you wouldn't have dared to do that, because 40% of the workforce was unionized, and if CEOs got a 30% increase, every other worker would have got a 30% increase, or the whole economy would have come to a halt with strikes. And what we have, of course, is we've broken the post-World War II social contract. No new social contract has been written except fear. And the fact of the matter is, with the communists gone away, the socialists gone away, and unions gone away, business is in a position to be much tougher on its workforce than it was previously. Now, if you look at these forces, they're going to fundamentally change the nature of the economy. One of the things you should have been thinking in your back of your mind, if the per capita GNP is up by this huge amount, and all these people's wages are down by this huge amount, who got it? It didn't get thrown in the ocean. The answer, to a large extent, was two groups. All of the wage increases that have accrued in the United States over the last 20 years have gone to the top 20% of the population. The other group that got a lot of the money was the elderly. In the last 20 years, the income share going to people age 18 to 35 has halved, and the income share of America going to people over the age of 65 has doubled. Now, if you think about those fundamental shifts in income, the capitalist economy follows those fundamental shifts in income. Think of the companies that got into trouble in the 1970s and 80s financially, either went broke or went to the edge of bankruptcy. The Macy's, the Gimbels, the Sears. Think of the companies that did well, the Walmarts downscale and the Bloomingdale's upscale. What do you think the chances are that just by accident all of the idiots could have been managing middle-class stores? God himself probably couldn't have managed Sears in the 70s and 80s, because the problem was the customers were disappearing. You could run the perfect store, and if your customers go broke, you go broke with them. Some of the workforce was shifting down to Walmarts. A smaller fraction of the workforce was shipping up to Bloomingdale's. And of course, if you look at these shifts in the distribution of income, they create tremendous problems for companies like Walmart going forward. Because Walmart has a tremendous market share in the bottom 60% of the population, but the income of their customers is going down. And it's interesting that this Christmas was the first Christmas in Walmart's history where its sales fell. Walmart didn't suddenly become an incompetent store. Its sales went down because it had no capacity to raise its sales by essentially expanding its market, and its customers were in the process of getting lower income. This is going to fundamentally change television. Television executives haven't yet gotten it, because when they talk about demography, they talk about wanting basically 18 to 30-year-olds. And in the 1950s or 60s, this was the right group to get. Lots of discretionary income, didn't yet have families they were responsible for, income expected to go up rapidly, habits not yet formed. And so if you're an advertiser, this is the group you wanted. And you wanted a TV program that would appeal to them. Today, this group has no prospects and no money. And it's absolutely a waste of time to advertise to the young, because you can't buy products if you don't have any money. Advertising and television program is going to refocus on the elderly. You know, what people say about the elderly, which is true, is they have habits which are very difficult to change, but people will learn that that's a good news, bad news thing. The bad news thing is that it is true that it's hard to make the elderly into your customers. The good news is once they're your customers, they never leave. Let's talk about briefly of the fundamental fault lines running out there in the economy. You know, there have been economies that have lasted for very long periods of time, very successfully, with enormous inequalities. The Roman Empire is probably the best example. Somewhere between a third and 50% of the people were slaves. The Romans themselves were divided into classes, and you couldn't do certain things in the right class, and they were very successful for 1,000 years. The problem, of course, is the Romans didn't believe in equality on any level whatsoever. The word basically didn't exist in their vocabulary, and it certainly was not a goal. Our problem is we believe in democracy. And so in the political area, we say one person, one vote. And how does that jibe with an economy that's moving towards inequality, which says we're going to have a much more inegalitarian distribution of income? Historically, the way we've solved that problem was by inventing the social welfare state. What the state would do is would make social investments in people, like education, to help them earn higher income. And if the capitalist economy didn't need you, you were sick, you were old, you were unemployed, you'd be picked up with unemployment insurance, pensions, etc. And so the state jumped in on the side of the people who weren't doing too well in the economy to say, we're on your side, democracy works for you. The interesting question, of course, is because of the elderly, we are withdrawing from all of those social safety net and social investments. The government is not going to be jumping in and saying, I'm on your side. And so then the question is, what happens as this gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger? And it's a little bit like the St. Andreas Fault. You know that there's going to be an earthquake, but nobody can predict when and whether it's a series of small little quakes or a big quake. Let me give you a second fundamental fault line. This is a fault line that has to do with this shift to man-made brain power industries. When was capitalism born? I know the exact year, 1794, and it has nothing to do with Adam Smith. It had to do with the invention of the steam engine. Because without the steam engine, you could not have capitalism, because as long as you depended on people power and animal power, it was simply impossible to have a lot of capital equipment at one place, which the capitalist could own, which we know as a factory. The steam engine made it possible. And basically, in a blink of an eye, we shifted from 8,000 years of agriculture into an industrial economy. Now, the problem, of course, is think about what we're shifting into, an era where brain power is the only strategic asset. How do you make capitalism work in an era when the capitalist can't own the strategic advantage because slavery is against the law? If you look at business firms where this is already true, investment banks, consulting firms, law firms, they don't run the way General Electric and General Motors run. Typically the workers, not the shareholders, pick the CEO. The workers typically are forced to leave some of their pay in the firm as a compulsory investment. Most of the time they are not listed on stock exchanges because it's very difficult to do that. And of course, probably the best example is Salomon Brothers. America's most famous capitalist, Warren Buffett, buys Salomon Brothers. One generation of partners makes a fortune, but the next generation of young rainmakers says, why should I work for Warren Buffett? Why should I share my income with him? What does he give me? He doesn't give me the steam engine, what the old-fashioned capitalist did. Now I have to buy a computer, but that's so cheap I can easily afford to buy my own. And what's happening, of course, at Salomon Brothers is the young rainmakers are leaving, and Warren Buffett may very well end up owning an empty shell because there's nothing left in that kind of an environment. Now the problem, of course, is if you think that brain power is the strategic asset, you'd think that business firms would be going out there and saying, who are our key knowledge workers and how do we attach them to the business firm? But of course, with downsizing, they're doing exactly the opposite. They're telling these key knowledge workers, you ought to think of yourself as have gun, will travel. I'm going to show you no loyalty, and therefore you should show me no loyalty. Now, there again, it's not at all obvious how that works in the long run. What happens when your key strategic asset walks out at night, can go to another employer and take all of your strategic advantage with him or her, and decides for themselves whether they want to put effort into your firm or they don't? Because in the modern world, it's much easier to be a Luddite than it was in 19th century industry. You don't actually have to throw a wrench in the machinery. All you have to do is quit thinking, and that's a lot easier to do than throwing the wrench, and a lot easier to identify who's basically quit thinking. And so if you look at these fundamental forces, what I'm arguing is we're in this period of punctuated equilibrium. We don't know exactly what's going to come out the other side. We know what the forces are. None of these forces can be changed. If you think of the 5 things I mentioned, there is nothing that you President Clinton or anybody else can do about any of these fundamental forces. The question is, are you the mammal, agile enough to live in a very different way than you lived before these forces came along? Now let me end by going back to Columbus, remember? You know, Columbus was smart in the sense he knew the world was round. But in MIT terms, Columbus was not terribly swift when it came to mathematics, because Columbus had to make two mathematical calculations to figure out how much water to put on the boat. The first calculation was, what's the diameter of the Earth? And when Columbus estimated that, he made it 1/3 too small. Second question he had to answer was, how far did Marco Polo walk? And when he estimated that answer, he made it 1/3 too big. Now, if you subtract a number which is 1/3 too big from a number which is 1/3 too small, you make what's called a major mathematical error. And Columbus estimated that the distance from the Canary Islands to the East Indies was 3,900 nautical miles. It's actually 13,000 nautical miles. And if you looked at the amount of water that Columbus put on his ships, before he got halfway there, he and all of his men would have died of thirst, and the name of Columbus would never have come down in the history books. Now, I suppose one moral you can read out of this story is it's more important to basically be lucky than smart, because it just happens to be that exactly 3,900 nautical miles from the Canaries, one runs into the Americas. The Americas were full of gold, and they made the Spanish Empire for the next 300 years. But that would be the wrong moral of the story, because you've got to remember something else. It took Columbus 7 years to persuade Ferdinand and Isabella to finance the expedition. It took enormous persistence. And without the enormous persistence, he never would have been in a position to have the enormous good luck. Secondly, and even more importantly, he had to have a vision of doing it in a different way, or he couldn't have had the good luck. And so today, as a final word, I wish you intelligence. But more than intelligence, I wish you good luck. And more than good luck, I wish you persistence. And most of all, I wish you a vision for a new world. Thank you very much.
Well, we've had quite a number of questions here. Dr. Thurow, I'd like to start off by asking you, we've just gone through the primary season. We have the presidential candidates before us now. Not limiting yourself simply to Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, but taking a look at the other candidates as well. Which of the presidential wannabes this year best understood or still understands the changes taking place in the global economy, and what solutions, could you assess the solutions of each to improve the economic standing of the United States?
Well, see, I think Mr. Buchanan had the right questions and all of the wrong answers. And the interesting thing is going to be, are Mr. Dole and Mr. Clinton going to give the right answers to those questions, or are they going to run away from the questions? Because, of course, answering those questions is very difficult. It's not something you do by a little jiggling of the American economy. It requires some profound changes. For example, if you didn't want falling wages and downsizing, you would have to either declare victory on the war on inflation or have a different war on inflation, be willing to let the economy grow much faster, and simultaneously have a radical program of re-educating and reskilling the bottom 60% of the population, and you would have to define a new social contract between labor and management. All three of those things would step on a lot of toes, be very difficult to do, and probably make healthcare reform look simple. And so I think there's going to be a tremendous tendency on the part of the political process to want to run away from the issues. And the question is, does the American public let them do it? See, the interesting thing about the response that Mr. Buchanan got is, why did it take so long? Wages have been falling in the United States for 20 years. Female wages have been falling for 15 years, and family incomes have been falling since 1989. Why is it only in 1996 that this whole thing popped up and became a big issue? And so I think the issue is not who understands. The issue is who's got the vision to persuade Americans to do the things they would have to do, given that you can't do them in 6 months. It would require some very long-run persistence. And to do that, you have to have a vision. And see, one of the big problems in the United States, if you said, what was the American vision over the last 50 years, the answer was fight communism. We didn't have to have a positive vision. We could have a negative vision. With communism gone, in the next 50 years, we have to have a positive vision, and then the question is, what is it?
Could you make some predictions about the future prosperity of American business? Who will be the winners and who will be the losers?
Well, if you take that list, industry list, the 7 names, I think those are the winners. The Japanese have approximately the right list. The only thing you could argue about is aircraft manufacturing, because the question there is telecommunication going to replace a lot of air travel? But telecommunication is a good example of the pessimism and the optimism. You know, AT&T just didn't lay off 48,000 people. This is about their 4th downsizing. They laid off maybe 300,000 people in these various downsizings. And so if you look at the telecommunication industry from the point of view of the people who used to work at AT&T, this is pessimism beyond belief. At the same time, all this new technology makes room for all kinds of new firms, the Pictortels, the MCIs, people doing things that they've never before done, and the total employment in the telecommunication industry is still about 900,000, exactly what it was when AT&T was at its peak, but it's very different wages, who gets paid is very different. And so telecommunications is a perfect example of both the pessimism and the optimism. It depends on where you look, and both are true. It's not that one is true and one is false. But I think, you know, the Japanese list is pretty close to the right list of those industries that you would say these are the most desirable and the industries which any country that wanted to generate a high standard of living would like to have for its citizens.
Speaking of downsizing, extent will U.S. corporations be hurt in the future because of the loss of employee loyalty and the whole aspect and dynamic of loyalty in America?
Well, see, I think this is a serious long-run problem, and I say this as somebody who's a business school dean. Because if you say, what's the big difference between MBAs in America who graduate today and ones who graduate 20 years ago, it's really 2 things. First of all, there's a level of cynicism there that wasn't there 20 years ago. And second, the level is you are stupid if you give your employer any loyalty, because your employer will never remember it when push comes to shove the other way around. And in the long run, we're introducing a management cadre into American corporations that is not going to be very respectful of American corporations. And in the long run, I don't think that's a recipe for success. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's possible to get a new social contract, because the intelligent people in the business community know that you can't run a social contract very long simply based on fear. Sooner or later, you have to have something positive to offer other than I'm going to fire you, and if you don't do what I told, you're out on the street. And so I think, you know, this is one of those long-run fault lines in our capitalist economy. We don't know exactly how it's going to come out, but we know something is happening there which isn't good in the long run.
So what would you do about those outrageous executive salaries? Legislate restrictions?
Well, see, I don't think that's the way to solve the problem. The way you solve the problem of the very high salaries is you got to go back and think about what the social contract is and what the sociology is. Because the same things that made it go up can gradually make it go down. It's like smoking. We didn't pass a law saying you can't smoke, but we used the enormous social pressures, and many fewer people smoke, and those who do, especially in a cold place like Boston, freeze all winter smoking out in the snowdrifts. And I think it's those sociological pressures that are basically going to push it down rather than any legislation, because this is the kind of place where you could pass almost any law you liked, and some smart corporate lawyers would find a way to get around the law, and so you have to persuade the corporations themselves that their long-run self-interest is not putting salaries up to that level, because if they put it up, sooner or later they'll need some political allies. And they won't have political allies if they're doing too much of this. See, an example of the same thing was an article which is in the New York Times a week or two ago about health care, where many big companies are putting their employees into managed health care where you don't get choices of doctors, you don't get certain treatments. And then for the top 50 executives or some number, they have a special health care system, which is kind of like the old-fashioned Blue Cross Blue Shield. Spend any amount of money, pick any doctor, go to any hospital. You're not subject to all these rules and regulations that your other employees are. Now, I think that's a tremendous disaster from the point of view of American corporations, because Americans are almost unique in the sense we're not envious of people who can afford penthouse apartments on Park Avenue. On the other hand, I think we're communists when it comes to health care. I don't want somebody else's kids getting treatments that are life-saving treatments that my kids don't get, right? And I don't care whether he's got more money than I do or not. I still don't want it to happen. And so I think when you start setting up things like two-tiered healthcare systems, and we're not talking the poor now, we're talking the middle class versus the people running the companies, that's something that's explosive, once again, in the long run.
The big trade agreements, GATT and NAFTA, was sold on the theory that increased international trade would grow the U.S. economy. What will happen with these world trade pacts in the scenario that you envision?
Well, see, in some sense, the promise wasn't true in the first place, because if Mr. Greenspan is putting a 2% limit on the economy, it wouldn't make any difference whether the trade pacts work or don't work. Because if they do work, he'll simply raise interest rates a little higher and keep growth at 2% anywhere. And so I think, the impact of these pacts depends on how fast you think the economy can grow. And their impact on us at a 2% growth rate are very different than their impacts on us at a 4% growth rate. And the whole issue of being imprisoned in a very slow growth economy does make it, if I can coin a phrase, into a zero-sum game, where you really are playing a game where nobody can fundamentally win. And see, education doesn't pay off in a 2% economy. At the moment, males at every educational level, including PhDs, have falling wages. There's no education program that pays off for males, because every escalator is a down escalator. And if I push somebody in at a higher education level, I'm just pushing somebody down the escalator a little fast, and the individual I help gets help, but somebody else gets hurt, and it's a wash as far as the whole system is concerned. At the moment, if you were being an economic determinist and running higher education simply based on who will economically benefit from a university education, you wouldn't let a single male into an American university. Because the only group of workers in America who are getting rising wages are college-educated women. And from that point of view, the only people you want to let into college are women, because they're the only people where there's an economic payoff.
The vaunted Japan Inc. recently has gone through a lot of economic turmoil with the banking crisis and other things. Yet in your book, you push for limiting imports from Japan. Wouldn't Japanese reprisals further worsen our exports and our relationship with Japan?
Well, see, Japan is a very interesting thing, because if you look at the crash in the Japanese stock market from 39,000 to 13,000 on the Nikkei, corrected for inflation, that's a bigger fall in the Japanese stock market than the fall in the American stock market from 1929 to 1932. And if you add in the fall in Japanese land values and the fall in the yen value of Japanese overseas assets, in a 5-year period of time, the Japanese have wiped out $14,000 billion worth of Japanese wealth, 1/3 of the total. This is a financial crash on a level that humankind has never before seen. And of course, it hasn't produced the Great Depression in the sense of a 30% reduction in GNP, but it's what produced this 5-year period of no growth, which the Japanese seem to be absolutely incapable of getting out of. Because to get out of it, I would argue, and I do in the book, you would have to organize a very different Japanese economy. The argument for Japan to be a domestically led economy as opposed to an export-pulled economy is not that Americans think that would be a good thing, or not that East Asians think that would be a good thing, but you can't restart the Japanese economy unless you're willing to do it. But there again, the Japanese are finding it very hard to make these structural changes that they're going to have to make if they're going to get out of this problem. Because the simple problem is, if you're a very small economy, you can be an export-led economy. When you become the world's second biggest economy, you're simply too big. Because you can export an extra $100 billion worth of products, which is what the Japanese did in the early 1990s, and the economy still doesn't start, because $100 billion isn't enough to jumpstart the Japanese economy. Now, what I talk about in the book is you've got a real problem on the Pacific Rim, because people say things about the Pacific Rim that, first of all, aren't even true. They say it's the fastest growing place in the world. Not true, because when they say that, they have to leave out the Philippines, leave out North Korea, leave out Vietnam, leave out Burma. And the other thing is, Japan is 15% of the world GDP, the rest of East Asia is 3%, and so -1 in Japan wipes out all the growth in the rest of East Asia. And East Asia as a totality probably had a 0% growth rate in the last 5 years if you look at the whole region. And the problem, of course, you have in that part of the world is you have a pattern of trade which is unsustainable. Because the other countries in East Asia have a big trade deficit with Japan, which they pay for by having a bigger trade surplus with the United States. And if their trade surplus with the United States disappears, they could no longer afford to buy Japanese imports, and whole hunks of the economy that depend on Japanese components and Japanese machineries would effectively have to shut down. Now the problem, and here again it's the earthquake analogy, we know that no country, including the United States, can run a big trade deficit forever. At some point that will end. It'll end slowly or fast, but when it does, there are going to be enormous repercussions on the Pacific Rim where the whole pattern of trade will have to very rapidly change.
You cite a depressing picture. We can't do anything about your 5 points. So, your prediction. How will we come out as a nation in the next decade?
Well, see, if you look at the reviewers of my book, that's all what they said. Very pessimistic. But when I wrote the book and when I read it, I don't see pessimism at all. Remember I said it's optimism and pessimism simultaneously, not one versus the other. And the only way it's pessimistic is if I'm saying if we want to succeed, we have to do some things differently, and you're saying Americans will never do anything differently, and therefore it's all down the tubes. See, I don't believe that. But if you believe that, you're pessimistic. Don't blame me for being pessimistic. But I think something does have to be added to the system. It's this vision. And what I argue in the book is, technically capitalism says the only thing that creates human welfare is leisure and consumption. I think that isn't factually true, and something has to be added to the system, the realization, which is that human beings are basically beavers and builders. And building things, in fact, creates welfare as well as consuming and leisure. And what we have to build in America that we don't have, if we're going to get out of this predicament, is this builder mentality, where you can say, I'm building something for a better future, even if I won't be alive when the better future comes along. And of course, that's very important if you have a nation of elderly. Because once you hit age 65, average life expectancy is about 16, 17 years, which means the average elderly person has 8.5 years to go, which means from the point of view of just technical rationality, they shouldn't be interested in anything that won't happen in the next 2 or 3 years, so they have a little time to enjoy it. But human societies can't work that way. We got to do lots of things that have 20, 30-year payoffs, and how do we persuade people to do them? And two good things at the moment, of course, is the most exciting thing in America is probably the internet. Started 25 years ago, wasn't profitable, financed by government for the first 20 years, or biotechnology, started 35 years ago, not profitable, financed by government for the first 30 years. And if you won't make those 25, 30-year investments, you won't have a successful economy 25, 30 years from now. And how do you persuade people to do that if you say the only thing human beings should work for is leisure and consumption? It doesn't work. So I think the builder mentality is the key ingredient.
Well, before I ask you our last question, I'd like to present you a few tokens here of our esteem. One is a cup so that you can drink the bitter economic medicine that's going to be coming up in the next couple of years. And the other is a certificate of appreciation from the National Press Club. For our last question, someone wants to know, in the recent U.S. News and World Report poll, Sloan School was ranked the second best business school in the country. To what extent, to what do you attribute this, and will Sloan try harder in the future?
First of all, the score for Stanford was 100 and the score for MIT was 99.9. That's statistical random error. We're really number one. But see, the comment I wanted to make, you said bitter medicine. Not true. What do you think? Probably the human society that invested more than any other is Pharaonic Egypt. Because for the 7 months the River Nile was in flood, they mobilized everybody to build the monuments. And do you think those Egyptians, as they were building the pyramids, the Sphinx, Abu Simbel, they sat there saying, my God, my standard of living's going down? Or do they sat there and said, I'm doing the grandest thing human beings have ever done, and 6,000 years from now they're going to marvel at what I did? I think they were the second. And I think that's the mentality we ought to have. We can be a builder society so that 6,000 years from now, people marvel at what we did. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. A decade ago, Lester Thurow was worrying whether radical changes in the U.S. and world economy would leave some American workers behind. Two important books, The Zero-Sum Game, published in 1980, and The Zero-Sum Solution, published in 1985, raised critical questions about the declining standard of living for many in the United States. Now presidential wannabes from Bill Clinton and Bob Dole to Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan are all echoing Thurow's concerns. Our guest today has been a professor of management and economics at MIT for more than 20 years, beginning in 1968. He was dean of the renowned MIT Sloan School of Management from 1987 until 1993. The Sloan School, of course, is famous for its integration of the practical and theoretical in management. The practical side of business came to him very early, for he spent 4 summers working in the Butte copper mines. A 1960 graduate of Williams College, he received his MA in 1962 on a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford and his PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1964. He taught at Harvard for 2 years after a term as a staff economist on President Johnson's Council of Economic Advisors. His experience there during the buildup of the Vietnam War taught him, as he said in an interview, that fouling up the economy wasn't done by accident, it was done deliberately with everybody's eyes wide open. He's been at MIT ever since and has just returned there following a 2-year leave of absence where he enjoyed a number of adventures ranging from a safari across Saudi Arabia, hunting polar bears with a camera in the Arctic, and mountain climbing in South America and the Himalayas. He currently chairs the Lemelson MIT Prize Program, which recognizes and promotes the spirit of individual ingenuity in America. We hope he feels at home here at the National Press Club. He has served on the editorial board of the New York Times as a contributing editor for Newsweek magazine and as a member of Time magazine's Board of Economics. His new book, The Future of Capital, speaks to the key factors causing economic change and offers strategies for profiting from today's world in flux. Let us extend a warm National Press Club welcome to Dr. Lester Thurow.
This afternoon, I would like you to imagine that you're Columbus. You know a place to make a lot of money. It's called the Indies. There's a conventional way to get there. It's called walking east. Marco Polo did it several hundred years earlier, but you have a better idea. It's called sailing west. The problem is you have a map, and on half the map it says terra incognita, unknown territory. But you've got to build a ship of some size, put sails on it, and your most important decision, of course, is how much water are you going to put on that ship. Because if you don't have enough water on that ship, you're all going to die of thirst before you get there, and this is not going to be a successful voyage. And I want you to think about that in the economic context. Now, if you're Columbus, obviously the first thing you want to know is, what do we know about the world? So let me start by giving you 5 topographical facts about our modern economic world. Topographical fact number 1. If you go back to the 1960s and correct for inflation, you'll find that the world capitalist economy grew at 5.0% per year. In the 1970s, that went down to 3.6. In the 1980s, it went down to 2.8.
Our speaker today, please write them on cards provided at your table and pass them up to me. I will ask as many as time permits. I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. From your right, Irving R. Levine, retired economic correspondent for NBC News and Dean, School of International Studies of Lynn University. Jackie Frank of Reuters. Kim Willinson, Japan Digest. Bill Miller, Industry Week magazine. Tracy Longo, Kiplinger's Finance magazine. Our guest today, Lester Thurow. Peggy Roberson, freelance journalist and chairman of the National Press Club Speakers Committee. Joan Walsh Cassidy, associate publisher, King Publishing Group. Hiratsugu Koike, Nikkei Washington Bureau. Aaron Zitner, Boston Globe. And Dave Martin, Congressional Quarterly and Secretary of the National Press Club. More than a decade. Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Doug Harbrecht, and I'm treasurer of the National Press Club and Washington News editor of Businessweek magazine. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, as well as those of you watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio or the Global Internet Computer Network. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind members of some upcoming speakers. On Monday, April 8th, Konstantin Simites, the Prime Minister of Greece, will talk about Greece at the dawn of the millennium, challenges and prospects. On Tuesday, April 9th, First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton will address the Press Club audience. And on Wednesday, April 10th, Bud Greenspan, award-winning sports historian and official cinematographer of the Olympic Games, will talk about the status of amateur sports. Transcripts and audio and videotapes of Press Club luncheons are available by calling 1-800-NPC-2334. If you have any questions for